As we look at faith under fire in the Middle East, let us note that this year, 2017, is Reformation 500. October 31st this year will mark the 500th anniversary of Dr. Martin Luther nailing the 95 Theses, the 95 arguments against unbiblical teachings and practices of the Roman Catholic Church. And our prayer this year should be, will you not revive us again, that your people may rejoice in you. We need to put feet to our faith. Our mission, Frontline Fellowship, has been 35 years in the front line, working behind enemy lines in communist and Muslim countries, restricted access areas, helping to serve persecuted churches throughout Africa, as far afield as Congo, Nigeria, Sudan, and Egypt. Our priorities are to assist persecuted churches, to evangelize in neglected and restricted access areas. The scripture commands us, lift up your eyes, look at the fields, for they are already ripe for harvest. And the Muslim Middle East represents the largest block of unreached Christians, the biggest threat to the church, the worst persecutors of the church. The most neglected mission fields of the earth are on the 1040 window, between the 10th and the 40th degrees latitude in the northern hemisphere, stretching across North Africa, from the Atlantic all the way through the Middle East to South Central Asia, ending in the Pacific. In that 1040 window, you have more than 3 billion, I think it's more like 4 billion non-Christians. And the Muslim Middle East is the toughest, hardest, most resistant and neglected part of that 1040 window. Faith is under fire in the Middle East. In the Middle East, we have got no end of wars and chaos and persecution and oppression. Radical Islam is on the march, and the destruction they're leaving in their wake is absolutely mind-boggling. Now, we're continually told that Islam is a peaceful and tolerant religion. And it's good that they're peaceful and tolerant. I mean, imagine if they were violent. Exterminate those who slander Islam. British soldiers burn in hell. Be prepared for the real Holocaust. Behead those who insult Islam. Peaceful and tolerant indeed. Freedom, go to hell. That's eloquent. Can't you just feel the tolerance? Boko Haram in northern Nigeria started out as a Quranic study group. It's one of the worst terrorist groups in the world. I'm going right into their backyard next week on a mission to northern Nigeria. And Boko Haram, we are told, means Western education is sacrilege. Now, anyone who knows any Arabic should question that, because Boko is obviously the book. In the Quran, it always means the Bible. Haram means forbidden. Boko Haram, the Bible is forbidden. You know what halal is? Halal is permitted. It's job reservation for Muslims. It's a pyramid scheme. But anyway, the point is halal is permitted. Haram is the opposite, forbidden. So Boko Haram can only mean, even if you know basic Arabic, the Bible is forbidden. And yet it's not just secular humanist journalists, but Christian journalists who propagate this propaganda lie that Boko Haram means Western education is sacrilege. They're not attacking Western education. They're bombing and killing churches. In northern Nigeria, just in a 5-year time period, 17,000 Christians were killed and 1,000 churches were attacked in northern Nigeria in just 5 years. Suicide bombings, car bombs, arson attacks. Do you know on 9/11, when the World Trade Center was attacked on September the 11th, 2001, more Christians were killed in Jos, Nigeria. Twice as many Christians were killed in Jos, Nigeria as Americans died in World Trade Center and Washington, D.C. terror attacks on that same day. Because as they heard the news of the World Trade Center towers coming down, Muslims rushed out of their mosque shouting Allah Akbar, and they attacked and destroyed 100 churches, destroyed over 100 businesses, and killed 9,000 Christians, 9,600 in that first day. These are car bombs. And this car drove straight into the pulpit area of the church, and that's what's left of the car. So can you imagine what happened to the congregation? When a car bomb goes off in the church parking lot, you can imagine how it sets fire to all the other cars. All kinds of destruction. Big churches are often targeted. And in many cases, it's churches where there's a large number of Muslim converts or converts to Christ from a Muslim background. Nigeria has been awash with Islamic attacks, and the churches have been targeted time and again. And yet the media ignores this. Most of the time, you don't even know what's going on in northern Nigeria. But this is part of the faith that's under fire in the Middle East. This is not unusual now in northern Nigeria to see machine gun nests, heavy walls, razor wire, and guard at the gates to protect people. In Iraq, churches have been devastated. It is genocide because just a few decades ago, 1 in 6 Iraqis was a Christian. Before the American invasion in 2003, there were 1,300,000 Christians in Iraq. In fact, the Christians in Iraq had more freedom than anywhere else in the Middle East except for Syria. Syria under Assad and Iraq under Saddam Hussein gave the most freedom of any Christians in the Middle East. All of Saddam Hussein's bodyguards were Christians. All of his catering staff were Christians because he knew Christians don't assassinate. And it was to their interest to keep him alive because they knew that any Islamist was going to persecute the church, and they had total freedom under Saddam Hussein. Religious freedom I'm talking about. You can go down to the Baptist church in downtown Baghdad, and if it's still there, their organ has got a plaque on it saying, "Gift of His Excellency the President Saddam Hussein." In fact, his bodyguards came from that church. And so, since the Americans liberated Iraq, as they call it, the number of Christians has decreased by over 1 million. Instead of 1.3 million Christians in Iraq, there's now not even 200,000. And the same thing in Egypt. Egypt had the largest number of Christians in all of the Middle East before Mubarak was overthrown. He used to have soldiers outside every single church, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, every day of the year, to protect the churches from Islamic attacks. And the moment Obama and his State Department under Hillary Clinton had managed to oust this ally of America, Mubarak in Egypt, and put in the Muslim Brotherhood, remember, assassinated President Sadat of Egypt, and also they had birthed Hamas, Hezbollah, and a whole lot of others. Yet Hillary Clinton called the Muslim Brotherhood a force for peace and moderation in the Middle East. Now, if that's a force for peace and moderation, imagine what a violent terrorist organization would look like. And they slaughtered many and destroyed a lot of churches in Egypt until the military in Egypt reasserted control and kicked out the Muslim Brotherhood. And that chaos cost churches being destroyed that had been standing for a long time. Well, in Iraq, it's the same thing. Phenomenal destruction caused. What happens with Islamic Sharia law comes into a country? Well, in Pakistan, this woman was a victim of rape. And so they had her condemned to being buried up to her waist and stoned to death. You think, did I hear that right? Yes, a victim of rape is killed under Sharia law, because according to Islamic Sharia law, a woman is 90% to blame for the rape because she has the power of enticement. And therefore, the rapist, he might get a slap on the wrist, but the victim of rape, she gets executed. Stoned to death in Pakistan, shot in the head in Afghanistan. This is during halftime at a soccer match. Hung in Iran. This is Sharia law in action. And women have no rights from their husbands. He can do anything. This woman in Pakistan had her nose cut off by her husband, and there was no recourse in law because he could do what he wanted with it. Christians in Kenya have Muslims throwing grenades and rocks through their windows. They've had terror attacks at their schools, colleges, shopping malls, and of course Sudan. Here we've got Sheikh Hassan al-Turabi in the white, and the dictator there is Omar al-Bashir, who is wanted at the Hague Court of Justice for genocide. This is the National Supreme Court, where they lock up and arrest Christians regularly for next to nothing. And all of this is justified by appealing to the Quran. Of course, South Sudan has got all kinds of problems with the government of Sudan wanting the oil fields still, and so they're still invading, doing forced removals, what they call ethnic cleansing, to get rid of Christians out of areas where they want to control oil. And in Darfur, we know about Islamic genocide taking place there. There's a lot going on throughout the south, and especially the Nuba Mountains right now. Targeting Christians, bombing, burning. Christians are under fire. Literally, by 21st century, fighter bomber jets supplied by Red China, and they're bombing churches and communities and hospitals in the Nuba Mountains today. I've preached about 1,200 times in South Sudan and Nuba Mountains. I've never preached in a school or church that hasn't been bombed at least once, sometimes 10 times. Once I was preaching to a church that had had 18 air raids in the previous 12 months. Christians are literally hiding under the rocks in the caves. And in Somalia, they've got Al-Shabaab. Somalia, in 1 year, 12 known converts from Islam, Christians, were buried up to the waist and stoned to death. Now, Muslims posted these on their own Facebooks to show themselves stoning to death a Christian who came from a Muslim background. In Egypt, the Christians are being bombed, attacked. This is the land that the Bible has a lot to say of, the land of the pyramids, the land of the pharaohs, the land where Joseph was sold into slavery by his wicked brothers. And yet he not only saved the Egyptians from famine coming, but even his own people. And as he said to his wicked brothers, you meant it for evil. God used it for good. And we see to this day what's going on in the Middle East. Christians are being oppressed, much like Joseph's descendants did when a Pharaoh who didn't know Joseph arose. And the key definitive salvation event in the Old Testament is the Exodus from Egypt, where the people of Israel were slaves under bondage. And Pharaoh had even instructed that every male boy born was to be thrown to the Nile River to drown and die. But Moses' mother put him into a basket and trusted that God would save his life. And in this case, the princess of Egypt, the daughter of Pharaoh, managed to save his life. And he was raised in the palace, and not even the throne was beyond his reach. And yet he chose rather to suffer with his own people than to accept the riches and the power and the pleasures of Egypt. God appeared to him in a burning bush in Egypt. And he was commanded to go and command Pharaoh, let my people go. 10 plagues hit Egypt, including the last plague, as we know, the Passover, when the angel of death passed through Egypt and slayed the firstborn of the Egyptians, all those who weren't protected by the blood of the lamb, the Passover lamb. Pharaoh still pursued them into the Red Sea. God ambushed them, and nobody got away. Egypt is a country much referred to in the Bible. There's much there that refers to prophecies of Egypt coming to God, which has happened. Egypt was a Christian country for 1,000 years, majority Christian country. Even after the Muslims took over, for hundreds of years later, the majority of the people in Egypt were still Christians. Today, in the land of the pharaohs, Christians are only about 12% of the total population. Where they used to be, it was their country. They're the indigenous people. A Copt is an Egyptian. Coptic's the Egyptian language. An Arab comes from Arabia. Arabic is the language from Saudi Arabia. Egypt is still being colonized and oppressed, and they're now a minority. They're only about 12% in their own country. This is the cave church, and every day of the week they apparently have services there. And this is a huge church, a very popular church. But the Muslim Brotherhood rose up, and they were trying to radicalize the people of Egypt, and so they were banned as a terrorist organization by the previous administration, by Mubarak. And when he was ousted, the Muslim Brotherhood came to power very much with the support, complete support and complicity of the American State Department and the CIA, who were working for their ends under Obama's instructions. And just to remind you of what a peaceful, tolerant religion Islam is, and what loving mothers want their children to bash their heads with swords that their head bleeds. I mean, this just shows you a devout Muslim. And they spoke about being the Arab Spring, like this was something like the Prague Spring in 1968, when the people of Eastern Europe were rising up resisting communism. But The Arab Spring was no spring at all. It was a Christian winter. The Arab Spring was an Islamicist, radical, anti-freedom revolution. And you can see from some of the posters where they were standing. I mean, this is not for freedom. Ayatollah Khomeini is not normally identified as toleration or, the icon of women's rights. My life for Muhammad. This is Morsi, the head of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, who took over, and it was a disaster under him. And you could see the hostility towards Christians, the burning of buildings that had been their churches for hundreds of years. The Egyptian Christians have suffered a lot. And the churches were under the Muslim Brotherhood weekly having funerals for martyrs, people killed by Muslims, and there was no recourse, there was no police action, because killing Christians is not a problem. The main church, the headquarters of the Coptic church in Egypt, in Cairo, St. Mark's, under attack and besieged, weekends of attacks. Now, the interesting thing is, in the Middle East, when a church attacked, all the Christians rushed to it to try and protect and defend it. I think in the West, if a church attacked, the people flee away. It's a very different mentality in the East. In Egypt, you'll hear Christians saying things like, we have a theology of suffering. It is a privilege to suffer for Christ. And you think of how in the West we've got theologies of prosperity. But in the East, where they've been persecuted for Christ, they have a theology of suffering. Which is closer to the spirit of Christ and the apostles and the Bible? In Egypt, there's a workshop a while ago where it was on martyrdom. And one of the discussion points was for each discussion group to come out with how are you, when your turn comes to be martyred, how will you use the opportunity for the glory of Christ? That was the assignment in the workshop. And one of the respondents said, I will say to ISIS or the Muslim Brotherhood, whoever it is that takes my life, you do not take my life from me. I lay it down willingly, so that you may know that Jesus Christ is the Lord and Savior, that you may come to know him as Lord and Savior. Do you think that there are people thinking like that? Under the Muslim Brotherhood, churches destroyed. I'm just showing you churches destroyed during the Muslim Brotherhood as part of the Arab Spring, which the United States government sponsored under Obama, which Hillary Clinton, the State Department, moved for. The destruction of Christians in the Middle East is vast. According to Operation World, in 2010, there were 15 million Christians in the Middle East, most of them in Egypt, Iraq, and Syria. Today, there's not even 12 million left. We've lost 3 million Christians, net loss in the last 7 years out of the Middle East. And that is primarily because of Obama and Hillary Clinton's State Department and the CIA supporting radical Muslims, burning and destroying. This is demonstrations in Egypt. Mr. Obama, thank you. Allah is burning churches and killing Copts in Egypt. Obama supports terrorism. This is in Egypt. There's the Bible Society shop burned out in Egypt by the Muslim Brotherhood. Churches, some of which had stood for 1,200 years, destroyed. Priceless manuscripts, ancient churches, destroyed by the Arab Spring, so-called, which our newspapers were trumpeting as, isn't this wonderful? It was an anti-Christian, radical, Islamicist, fundamentalist revolution. Friends in Egypt sent me this picture. Praying inside the church. This is just the weekend of 14th August to 16th of August 2013. Muslim Brotherhood destroyed 70 churches, monasteries, dioceses, and other Christian buildings like the Bible Society. Car bombs. Christian Copts in Egypt being targeted, kidnapped, and yet the United States of America gave all their support to the Muslim Brotherhood, giving them top-of-the-line tanks, helicopter gunships, and all kinds of top fighter jets. But the moment that the people of Egypt kicked out the Muslim Brotherhood and reasserted control, they put sanctions on the country. When a persecution stopped, then they put sanctions on the country. It is genocide. There's no better word to describe what they're doing. They're trying to destroy the Christians. The Christians of Egypt are already only 12% of the population of what used to be their country. And the Arab colonials are continuing to butcher Christians, kidnap Christians, Christian blood is on the hands of Muslim extremists. Why indeed? These are just some of our brothers and sisters in Christ murdered by Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. Just to give a face to the victims. This message, this postcard I was sent, they may destroy our churches, but they cannot destroy our faith. The church is not buildings. The church is people, born again by the power of the Holy Spirit, washed in the blood of the Lamb, names written in the Lamb's book of life. You cannot destroy the church by sending Christians to meet their Lord in heaven. Death for the Christian is not fatal. Death for the Christian is not final. Jesus is the resurrection and the life. I had, on a radio program in California, somebody phone in on a phone-in program and say, well, who cares about the Copts in Egypt? I mean, they're Orthodox. They're not real Christians. I said, excuse me. I said, these are people who have stood firm under an Islamic regime, them and their relatives, for 1,400 years, when it would be so easy to convert under all that pressure. What have you suffered for Christ? What have you sacrificed for Christ? He said, they're willing to die for Christ. I said, I'll question your salvation in California before I question their salvation in Egypt. We should stand with our brothers and sisters in Christ who are suffering in Egypt. Anyone who's willing to suffer for Christ is my brother and sister in Christ. Richard Wurmbrand, in his Tortured for Christ, said, now here's Lutheran, and in the prison cells with him, there was Coptic, Orthodox, and others, and he said, when you end up in the same prison cell, and you're both suffering for Christ, it's hard to think of him as the enemy. Now he is my brother. And he even wrote a book, If This Was Christ, Would You Give Him Your Blanket? And actually it was an Orthodox priest who actually had given him some grief beforehand that he's talking about, and he gave him his blanket. The Christians in the Middle East are under tremendous pressure and intimidation and terror. And remember, it's not just them, it's their children. It's their wives, their sisters, their mothers. They all are being targeted. This is hard. It's one thing for us to talk about it, but it's nothing for them to live it. Okay, pop quiz. Can anyone identify this city here? I'll give you a clue. Its name is in the Bible. Damascus. The Apostle Paul was from Tarsus, and he was converted on the road to Damascus, which is in Syria today. Okay, this is Damascus, the capital of Syria, under evil Assad, and terrible oppression. This is the oppression in Egypt, in Syria before American intervention to bring about democracy. 6% of the population of Syria are Christians. And this is the most evil man in the world, according to American media today. And yet the Christians don't see him as the enemy because he provides them with tremendous religious freedom. In fact, they say that there's more religious freedom for the Christians in Syria under Assad than there is anywhere else in the Middle East. Okay, I don't go for this sort of decor. This isn't our style of church. We're not Orthodox. Nevertheless, these are leaders of different Orthodox and Assyrian churches in Syria who are coming to their leader and looking to him for protection from ISIS. Again, this is not our style, but you can't question their sincerity and that there's a devotion for Christ because they're doing this in a Muslim Middle East. I mean, this is pretty difficult. This is a church, and notice this evil dictator and his wife in church, not surrounded by their bodyguards, with Christians wanting to get pictures taken with them. Interesting. This is how the church flourished under the dictatorship. Okay, not quite our style, but these people are serving the Lord. Now you can see before American democracy and after American democracy. So much better. You can see the improvements that US foreign policy has made in Syria. And this is what's happened. They have been bombing the life out of these poor people in Syria, and the churches have been ransacked and destroyed. Where are the rebels getting the weapons from? Well, the CIA set them up with the support of Saudi Arabia, Oman, and Turkey. ISIS is nothing other than agents for the CIA and for Saudi Arabia who are working together. And for that matter, when they talk about chemical weapons in Syria, bear in mind that America supplies phosphorus chemical weapons for Israel to use against people in the West Bank. Anyway, that's also banned by the Geneva Convention. They don't seem to mind that. And remember the original moderate rebel that America supported and the CIA trained and armed? That's right. Osama bin Laden. He was trained and armed by the Americans to fight the Russians in Syria, in Afghanistan. Not having enough forethought to think that, well, once the Russians are out of Afghanistan, then what? Then you're going to be the target. Beheading people in public is what the Saudi Arabian government has been doing for the 200 years of Wahhabianism that has dominated them. And ISIS is indistinguishable from Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is the world's leading beheaders of people. They can behead a couple of hundred people in a given year for anything from conversion to Christ to who knows what. Princesses have been beheaded from the royal family in Saudi Arabia. And by the way, when the Death of a Princess film was to be screened on independent television in England and on public broadcasting service and so on in America, the Saudi embassy complained to the British and American governments who banned and cancelled it. I mean, that's in countries that have freedom of speech, remember? And the film Death of a Princess wasn't able to be shown on independent TV in England or on a PBS in America because Saudi Arabia complained. And by the way, not only Saudi Arabian embassy, but all the oil companies as well, like Caltex and Chevron. They stepped in and put pressure for the government to prevent freedom of speech in America and Britain on the execution of a Saudi princess because of a conversion to Christ, suppressed. The man who founded the ISIS, al-Bukhari, he was a prisoner of America under Bush, and the first month that Obama was president of America, he released him. So January 2009, Bukhari was released, and he immediately formed ISIS. And the man who gave him the first $500 million to get it going was Ambassador Stevens. Well, he wasn't an ambassador then, but the Ambassador Stevens who died in a Benghazi attack in 2013, was it, in Benghazi in Libya? He took the $500 million and gave it to them. Here's the bag man who got them going. You know, what a man sows. Cause and effect. Why is there this massive tsunami of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and millions of people fleeing from Syria and other parts of the destabilized Middle East into Europe? It's all since the Arab Spring. When NATO bombed Libya and destabilized this regime of Gaddafi, and since ISIS started the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, and since America's been waging war to topple Syria and to undermine their best ally in the Middle East, as they called him, the Force for Peace and Stabilization, Mubarak in Egypt, since then, you've had absolute chaos. Obama has caused chaos in the Middle East. President Bashar al-Assad says terrorism is like a cancer. When you deal with the consequences rather than the root causes, it'll only spread faster. The West deals with terrorism in a hypocritical way. They call it terrorism when it hits them, and revolution, freedom, democracy, and human rights when it hits us. Isn't that true? The West spent 10 years fighting terrorism, killed millions doing so, invading Iraq, Afghanistan, and so on. Now they're supporting the same terrorists in Syria. And they are. I mean, ISIS and Al-Qaeda are totally working together and all the rest. And Al-Qaeda attacked America, they said, in 2001, and as a cause of the war. And now, under Obama, they were supporting the very same terrorists to the war on terror was meant to be against. Has terrorism increased since the war on terror began in 2001? Yes, just like poverty has increased since America declared war on poverty, and drug dealing has increased since they declared war on drugs. It seems whatever they set out to wage war on, they multiplied. The US government's brilliant at multiplying wars. We told the West it should not support terrorism and give it political cover because it would affect all of your countries and your people, and they didn't listen to us. That beautiful church I showed you earlier, that's what it looks like now. This is what ISIS does when they take over a church in Syria. They get rid of the cross and put the black flag. This is an American journalist in Syria who exposed that the Turkish government, who's meant to be a member of NATO, was aiding ISIS On live TV, she proved it. 2 days later, she was killed in a car accident, and the US government refuses to investigate this journalist's death. The first victim of war is truth. This is what ISIS does when they attack villages. Of course, there's no pictures, so from eyewitness accounts, they've had to put a painting of the hideous atrocities taking place by ISIS. The car bombs. Well, what's the difference between car bombs and aerial bombardment? If you don't come to democracy, democracy will come to you. Proven way to improve democracy is saturation bombing of cities, right? Worked for the Second World War, killing a few million people, destroying 60-something cities. That's the way you improve democracy. Vote Democrat for kinder, gentler imperialism. They gave him a Nobel Peace Prize for bombing 8 countries. And I think in his last year in office, he authorized 26,000 air raids and bombs, smart bombs. Yep. I think if you need more batteries, you're welcome. I think that's one of the things. We can run out of power. So isn't it interesting how today you get a Nobel Peace Prize for being black, and then he gives a medal to someone for being gay? And what is democracy? Democracy coming to a neighborhood near you by a smart bomb. 26,000 smart bombs dropped by Obama in his last year in office, just in the Middle East. That's not counting all 8 years of his miserable, worthless existence in the White House. But when is it going to dawn on people in America that the reason why people hate you is not because you're free, but because you're bombing them? They don't, I mean, just one of those things. There's a lot of people who, for some reason, don't like being bombed. Even according to Operation World by Patrick Johnson, do you know the biggest arms traffickers in the world right now is the United States of America? At least it was under Obama. America had reached the stage by 2010 that it was producing more weapons than the rest of the world combined. The United States has now become, I remember when I grew up, the Soviet Union armed the terrorists, and the Soviet Union provided weapons for terrorists. Today, well, as of last year, that was officially the United States. The United States was the biggest terrorist-supporting state in the world. And Russia was helping to defend the Christians in Syria. I mean, has the world turned upside down? For most of my life, Russia's been the enemy. And right now, Christians in the Middle East are praying for Russia to come and save it from American armed terrorists. And yes, this is what goes on. This picture comes from a missionary in Syria. A Syrian church, Coptic church, with a lot of soldiers in there. They're Christian soldiers in the Syrian army. Why would a Syrian Christian not be in the army, knowing that the only thing standing between them and their family and beheadings and worse is the Syrian army? Because the West are supporting the terrorists, Russia's supporting the Syrian government, and the Syrian government's trying to protect their citizens, which includes Christians. This is not Photoshop and this is not propaganda. There are Christians marching in Damascus with crosses and a picture of Assad, who's meant to be a hated dictator. So, a friend from Syria sent this. I stand with Assad because he supports all faiths, protects all churches, treats all equally, and fights terrorism. Well, that's a lot better than what people could say in America under Obama. Now, if you want to make sense of this chaos going on in the Middle East right now, the most ridiculous thing is this. Russia is fighting to protect the Christians. America and the NATO forces are fighting against the Christians and supporting the Islamic terrorists. I don't know if that makes any sense to anybody here, but if somebody had told me that 20 years ago as a scenario, I would have thought they were taking drugs. Now, Vladimir Putin, head of Russia, is ordering Bibles to be printed and put in every hotel room. We used to smuggle Bibles into Russia. He's put chaplains into every part of the military. He's hosted family conferences, pro-life, pro-family conferences, with 1,000 delegates from 100 countries of the world, all expense paid for, in the Kremlin. He's in church regularly and praying. Now, if you want to Google Vladimir Putin's testimony, you decide if it sounds legitimate to you or not. But he gives a very credible testimony of his mother being a dedicated Christian, his father being a radical communist party member, and how his mother secretly had him baptized, secretly gave him his baptism cross, which he still keeps around his neck now. His mother gave it to him after his conversion. Describes was it a car accident or a fire in his home in 1995, which was a revival point when he converted to Christ and became a faithful member of the Orthodox Church. And they are now, he's a regular church member, and the patriarch of the Orthodox Church says he's a faithful member of the Russian Orthodox Church. Again, not our kind of brand, but great improvement on Lenin, Stalin, Brezhnev, Khrushchev, burning churches. He gives $200 million a year to rebuilding churches as part of the restitution to the churches for the destruction of churches done under communism. There's 200 churches being built in Moscow right now. So who's backing ISIS? Saudi Arabia, obviously, Turkey, obviously, Qatar, Israel, America, Britain, and France are all supporting the ISIS terrorists. Why would Israel be supporting them? Because they're fighting Syria, and Syria is a strong border country, and the last thing they want is a stable, strong Arab country on their border, apparently. So these people are all supporting the beheaders of Christians and the blower-uppers of churches. Just to remind you, back in 1995, was it? When we had the Wag the Dog war, and when Bill Clinton was on the front page of newspapers with his sex scandals in the White House, and so they started a war in Yugoslavia, bombing Serbia to distract attention from his internal scandals. So this picture came on Time, or Slime, Newspeak, Useless News and World Report, and they spoke about concentration camps. This has been proven to be total fraud. This man was not being starved. He had a birth defect, and asked him to take his shirt off and come to front. Everyone else around were normal. There was no concentration camp. The strand of barbed wire stretched barely half the width of this church. You could come in and out and around any point. The cameramen positioned themselves on one side, asked the people to go on the other side, asked them to come to front. It was a feeding center, and there was no restrictions. There was no fenced-in area. They just had the journalists produced this barbed wire to take the pictures through to make a photo of. And on this basis, managed to persuade the people of America to go and bomb Serbia, which happens to be Christian. And then they brought out this in Newspeak, the face of evil. So this Milosevic, the head of Serbia at the time, is the face of evil. And here's the reason to go to war, because he is committing genocide against the poor, innocent Muslims. Here, Milosevic is the ex-president of Serbia in the Hague International Court of Justice. And you all remember the beginning of the trial, I'm sure. Does anyone remember the results of the trial? The poor man died in prison before they were able to come to the conclusion. But the result came out, was it a year and a half ago? Totally innocent of all charges. There was no genocide. There was no plan for genocide. None of these atrocities. He is innocent. His entire administration is innocent. The whole thing was fabricated. That's the International Court of Justice in The Hague in Holland has posthumously declared him innocent of all charges. And yet, America and NATO waged a war against Christian Serbia on the side of Islamic Bosnia, and Bosnia was being supported by Al-Qaeda terrorists as well, by the way. So again, we were on the side of the Islamic terrorists, and we're bombing a Christian state. Well, when we say Christian, I'm talking about Orthodox Christian. So according to my father-in-law, who was a missionary for over 60 years, smuggling Bibles throughout Eastern Europe, he ministered all throughout Yugoslavia. He knew Yugoslavia well. He suffered. He is locked up and then so on. He said, I would never, ever, ever get involved in a war in the Balkans. It's a powder keg. You don't get involved. This goes back centuries, because Ottoman Turkey dominated the area for centuries, and the Bosnians are the Christians who apostatized and became Muslims. And the Serbs are those who refused to. And so there's a lot of bad blood between the Bosnians, which are Serbs who became Muslims, and the Serbs who remained Orthodox. But he said, if we were ever forced to choose, I would obviously have to choose to fight on the side of the Serbians against the Bosnians, never on the side of the Bosnians. He said, I can't believe that my government, the American government, is supporting the Islamic terrorists against Christians. Anyway, friends of mine in Britain refer to the BBC as the Bolshevik Broadcasting Corporation or the Biased Broadcasting Corporation. And it's interesting that liar is somehow embedded in Hillary's name. Now, I've documented a lot of the wars against Christians in the Middle East. This film that we're going to see now, Islam Rising, I had a hand in helping to produce it. Carol Matriciana, who helped produce the films on Sudan, the Hidden Holocaust, she got together an amazing group of people, former terrorists, former Muslims, former converts to Islam, to give the inside scoop on it. And, of course, afterwards, after we've shown the film, we'll go into looking at some of the Muslim evangelism workshop. But are there any questions before we go to this film, Islam Rising? Just on some of the outrageously shocking things I've been saying on the Middle East and Syria. Yes? I hope and pray not. We were horrified and shocked at the Tomahawk missiles launched at that airbase. These sarin gas chemical warfare attacks are false flag operations transparently. You know, America specialized in false flag operations forever. Just take the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which got them going in, at full steam in Vietnam, which was proven to be false, and admitted even by the people who had reported at the time. You know, LBJ wanted an incident, so they just manufactured one. The Philippine incident, when the Maine, a U.S. battleship, got sunk, blown up actually, in Manila Harbor, in Havana Harbor, and the Americans wanted war with Spain. Spain was in decline, and they were well positioned. And in fact, old Hearst, who ran the newspapers, he sent his journalist there to report on the war, and the man cabled back, said, "There's no war here." Hearst said, "Just hang around. We'll provide the war. You provide the pictures." And later on, the Maine blew up, almost certainly an own goal, just for fun. And at that point, that the Spanish were meant to have attacked an American warship, which would have been insane, in their own harbor. The American fleet was positioned to destroy the entire Spanish fleet in the Pacific, take over the Philippines and a whole lot of other places, and Cuba. And all of this was, again, a false flag operation, as is admitted now. And they've been doing this for ages. When the Sink and Lusitania papers came out after being sealed for 60 years, found out the U.S. administration of Woodrow Wilson and First Lord Admiralty of Britain, Winston Churchill, had said, look, to get the Americans involved in the war, we need to sink a ship with a lot of Americans on it. They decided the Lusitania was ideal. It was planned by the Americans and the British to help get the Americans into war on the side of the British against Germany. So the Lusitania files were sealed for 60 years. And whenever governments seal files, like the Martin Luther King files are sealed for 80 years, is when governments are lying and they need to cover up things. So you know that there's lies. The last time that they had a gas attack in Syria, the gas attack was obviously organized by the Americans' own people. It was gas provided by the CIA to Saudi Arabia, who got help from the Turks to deliver it to the right place, and it went off the day after the International United Nations Chemical Warfare Investigation Team arrived, the day after they arrived. I mean, how convenient can that be? Just when Obama wanted an excuse to bomb Syria. This one, the story that we've got from military people on the ground, including US military people, have said the Syrian army was bombing a terrorist base, and they didn't know that the terrorist base contained massive quantities of gas. When they bombed them, the terrorist gas, which had been supplied from NATO member Turkey anyway, exploded, and so there were people who suffered from the gas attack. But it obviously was not their gas attack. It was the Syrians weren't using the gas. It was their own gas that was being used. This is an own goal, but again, the timing was just perfect, and they used it for attack. Now, presidents probably have to trust the people around them. I'm disappointed at the lack of discernment at something which just about every military leader I know in the US and so on have said, look, this is so obviously a false flag operation. First of all the weapons inspectors testified that Syria had handed all their chemical weapons over back in 2013. They don't have any more. But even if they had them, it would be insane for them to do it because you can do almost anything in the world today. But gas is one thing you're not allowed to. You can burn people alive with napalm and phosphorus. That's fine. You can nuke them, but you're not allowed to use gas. And so that's the one thing that will trigger Americans to actually bomb somebody again if they needed a reason. And so the last thing in the world, a clever person like Assad, and Assad, remembers, he's a doctor, trained in Britain. His English is excellent. His knowledge of everything as well on top of it. As he said, you can just Google his responses. Why would we do this? We're winning the war. The last thing we need to do is aggravate America. Here's the big point around the world. And that's what's going on at the moment. It's so fraudulent, it's embarrassing. And I don't know one American military person, I've got friends up to generals in American Air Force and so on, none of them believe this propaganda. So this is just war propaganda. It's falsified. Yes? Do they have anything else? Yes. Sure. Yes. 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 Well, I've never met Vladimir Putin, of course, but I'm impressed by a lot of what he's done. Since he's become president of Russia, there's a whole new wave of freedom of religion, of the churches, and obviously his preference is for the Russian Orthodox Church, which is the national church, and he's part of it and so on. And many Russians are furious about the cults coming in. Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, name it, claim it, and frame it, prosperity cult, loonies. And so they are cracking down on some of these who they see as causing nothing but grief and trouble and debasing the people there. He's cracked down heavily on abortion, heavily on pornography, heavily on the gay GB, pink agenda, homosexual lobby. He's been hard on that. The reason why Western journalists hate Putin is not because he's a dictator or anything like that. It's because he's against the homosexual agenda. It's because he's pro-Christian. No wonder they hate him. I mean, he's actually come out against blasphemy and pornography. For example, Pussy Riot or whatever they were, they went into the #1 church of Russia, third largest church in the world, Christ's Cathedral, and they desecrated it. So of course they got thrown in prison and all. I mean, that was a crime. It was serious crime. And they dealt with it very decisively. Now, of course, people who love pornography, blasphemy, abortion, and homosexuality in the West hate Putin because he's reasserting the stands that the average Russian wants. I've got a lot of Russian friends and I've got a lot of Ukrainian friends. Of course, the Ukrainians aren't excited about him because they've got a war going on. But the Russians are generally overwhelmingly supportive because they say Russia needs a strong central leader. I mean, nothing else is going to do. And the fact that he's so friendly to the gospel makes them really delighted. Bear in mind, they've had 70 years of communist persecution in Russia, so this is a breath of fresh air. Statistically, according to the British Economist, real income for people in Russia has increased 800%. People are living with an 800% real income increase since he's taken over. Now, if you take South Africa under Zuma and so on, Director of the South African Reserve Bank, Stephen Mitford Goodson, said that by the gold standard in real buying power, 500 Rand today can't buy what 1 Rand could buy in 1982. The South African Rand has been debased to 1/500th. So forget state capture, forget theft, forget corruption. The inflationist country has stolen more savings, pensions, and earnings and worth of people than everything else you could ever imagine. And I mean, that's from an economist saying how we've been stolen from. But in America, the people today are the first generation in America's history that are poorer than their parents' generation. Every generation has been doing better. And America's income's gone down in a real sense in the last 10 years. But under Putin, in the last 16 years, they've increased 800%. Now, how can you be a socialist dictator when free enterprise is flourishing in the country? And then the Orthodox Church in Moscow pleaded with him to intervene in Syria to save the Coptic churches, which are being wiped out by the ISIS terrorists. And the Russian government gave as their prime reason for getting involved in Syria to protect the Christians. Now, this should remind you, if anyone remembers Florence Nightingale and the Crimean War and the charge of the Light Brigade, do you know whose side we were on then? Muslim Turkey, the most anti-Christian regime in the history of mankind to that date. In other words, before Stalin and Mao Zedong. But what happened was the Ottoman Turkish Empire slaughtered a whole lot of Christians in the Holy Land, in Palestine, which they controlled. The Russians then declared war on Turkey to punish them for slaughtering Christians because they were Orthodox, and the Russians always saw themselves as the historic guardians of the Orthodox churches in the Middle East, as they're very closely related doctrinally. France and Britain went to war on the side of the Muslim persecutors of the church, the Turks, against Christian Russia, trying to reassert the rights of Christians in the Middle East. That's the background to the Crimean War. Our ancestors, if anyone here has British ancestors like me, our ancestors were fighting for the Muslim terrorists back in the Crimean War of the 1850s, and today America and NATO are fighting on the side of Muslim terrorists in Syria. They're supporting the ISIS terrorists against a regime that's trying to protect Christians. Same with the whole Arab Spring. The Arab Spring was cooked up in Washington, D.C., and through Oman and Qatar, which is just an American client state, Saudi Arabia and Turkey, they've been causing havoc in the Middle East through ISIS. And Russia's come in to try and protect the Christians. So from my perspective, and this is strange because for most of my life the Russians were the enemy, but right now America is supporting the terrorists and Russia's protecting Christians from terrorists. If that doesn't sound bizarre to you, then you must be very young. But for those of us who are older, we never thought the day would come when the Russians would be the people that the Christians are praying for. You know, oh, may the Russians come to deliver us, you know, protect us from the Americans. Yes.
I think after Barack Obama was voted into power, a lot of people felt that because of his close allegiance to Israel, and he made it known that he was America has been a lifelong partner and protector of not Obama, but Trump.
Yeah.
He's been a lifelong protector and partner of Israel. He's reinforced that belief. Do you think that, like the lady asked, that he would, do you think that he would be the person that you think he would be a close ally of Israel?
Yeah.
Because he seems to be being on America, being on Parliament, doing a lot of good things with it. Although the general media and the public doesn't seem to think so, but my strong belief is that he is a man of the maturity. Even though he's so rich, the Lord used to be the Lord.
Yeah. It could be, but bear in mind, America is not a dictatorship. The president has a lot of power, but he doesn't have all power. And there's a lot of different lobby groups. And Israel's got a phenomenally, colossally well-funded lobby group. I mean, they control just about all the banks and most of Hollywood, most news media. There's 6 people in America that control the entire mainstream media. 5 are Jewish, and the only one who's not Jewish is the most pro-Israel of all, and that's Fox Media's Rupert Murdoch. So he's even more pro-Israel than all the others. So there's no way that an American president can get away with an anti-Israel policy because they are the biggest lobby group. And anyway, they get something in the region of $30 billion a year in either free aid, weapons, or just money. So they've got the money to buy up every lobbyist and every member of parliament anyway. So Israel lobby is colossal, and I don't think any American politician can get by without at least paying lip service to their cause. Trouble is, Israel's policy is not compatible with Christian freedom in the Middle East, because Israel doesn't want a strong military state in Syria. And so they think supporting someone who's going to bring about Assad will suit their military foreign policy goals. But the Christians there are getting beheaded and their church getting blown up. That's not part of Israel's foreign policy defense strategy thinking. And this is what bothers me, is that all over the world you've got people waving flags for Israel and so on. And I mean, gee, we want them to do well and be blessed. But who speak up for the persecuted church? The 15 million Christians in the Middle East who've got it in the neck over America's foreign policy. Now, it might suit Israel's foreign policy to have destabilized neighbors around its borders, so that there's no strong cohesive potential enemy, but it doesn't help the Christians in those countries who are getting it in the neck, literally, when Muslim terrorists take over. And so I'm deeply concerned that Christians think they've got to speak up for a country that has one of the biggest militaries in the world, phenomenal public relations department, and they've got embassies all over the world. But who's representing the Christians in the Middle East? If we don't stand up for our brothers and sisters in Christ being literally beheaded, then who else is going to do it? There's not a government on the planet aside from Russia that seems to care. And that's why I'm not going to complain if Putin wants to come in and rescue Christians in Syria. Good for him. About time somebody did that, because the rest of Europe seems to not care one bit. In fact, they'll probably help the Muslims. You know, do you need a sharper sword? I mean, can we help you some way to behead more Christians? It seems most of Western Europe are entirely on the side of the Islamic extremists. But anyway, I'm not a politician. I don't want to get into American politics. But insofar as it affects the persecuted church, I feel we must speak up. Because who else is going to say anything for the church? And I've been a missionary for 35 years to persecuted Christians. So I feel in tune with them, and I feel completely alienated from the political rabble-rousing of the others. I don't care much what goes on out there. If they just will leave the Christians alone and let us continue to fulfill the Great Commission and win our neighbors to Christ. Yeah. Yes. I think we must blame Barack Hussein Obama, President of America at the time, for the fall of the previous Christian administration in Nigeria, because the people in Nigeria were so furious over the kidnapping of those hundreds of girls and the failure of the government to rescue them over a period of years, that many people made it clear to their president, good luck, Jonathan, if you do not bring back our girls and destroy Boko Haram, we won't vote in the next election. And this last election that they had in Nigeria, what was nearly 2 years ago, there was a record low number of votes, and millions of Christians stayed away from the polls in punishment to the government for doing nothing. Now, as a result, an ex-Muslim military dictator got voted, and he's the present leader of Nigeria. But U.S. Chief of Staff testified before the Congress that they had real-time proven intelligence on the location of those girls and the leaders of Boko Haram, which, if they had provided to the Nigerian military, would have enabled them to rescue the girls and wipe out the entire leadership of Boko Haram. But the White House instructed them not to pass the information over to Nigeria because of their unwillingness to accept American policies on homosexual marriage. So the privileges for perverts agenda of Obama's White House destabilized the largest nation in Africa and permitted an ex-Muslim military dictator to take power in a country, ousting a Christian, whatever his weaknesses and failures, he's still not as bad as a Muslim taking over. And literally, that's the pettiness of America under Obama. That's why they went for Uganda, that's why they went for Zambia, bullied Malawi, Kenya, and Nigeria, because they were not open to the homosexual agenda. They said no to, well, you can't call what God calls an abomination, you can't call that a marriage. And so that's why Nigeria got bullied into this. And so I do see a direct link. US petty, pink agenda, gay GB, pink Inquisition politics destabilized a country that was fighting for its life against Islamic terrorism. I'm not surprised that Islamic terrorism has decreased in Nigeria since, because they've got one of their guys in their presidency now. So, any other comments?